Hello.
Danny, this is Rob Couteau.
Hey, how are you?
Thanks for being available. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for the kind words about the book.
Wonderful book. You know, I spent the last 2 days rereading it, and after a while I began to wonder if there was a thread running through the 60s counterculture movement, and I came to the conclusion that the unifying theme is, as you say, agape, a term you use at various times for universal love. Would you agree with that? And if so, what was the significance of agape in the 60s?
Well, I don't think there was just one counterculture, going on. So I'm not sure that all the members of SDS would, who were important, part of the fabric of what happened in the 60s. And, depending on how you define the counterculture, I know Tom Hayden used to use the word to distinguish it from political radicalism. Other people use it in a way that includes that. So I think, to me, that corny, the phrase I just cooked up for the book of the Hippie Idea, to me, in its purest sense, and what Allen Ginsberg was kind of talking about a lot of the time, and what some of the Beatles, "All You Need Is Love," and a lot of what to me was the purest essence of it. To me, agape was the aspiration, certainly.
I mean, if you broaden the definition, one could possibly say that the long-term goal of even someone like the SDS was a concern beyond the personal self. Yes?
Yes. No, it was, and that's where there was commonality, was that the policy goals to end the war, to have more economic egalitarianism, to end racism and sexism, was consistent with the spiritual values. But I would say, I think that a lot of, there are certain cohort of the left that were rationalists and Marxists,
yes,
or informed by Marx, that didn't really believe in mysticism, but had an ethical construct that was their guiding light. And I think that again, the goals of the issues that were prevalent in '67, which was basically anti-racism, anti-war, were consistent. With I think most not everybody that was a radical liked mysticism, Allen Ginsberg, the Maharishi, or Donovan's records, but everybody that was a hippie was against the war.
Absolutely. Good point. Yeah. You begin the book with a wonderfully detailed and nuanced account of the January 1967 be-in. Do you think this was one of the first collective expressions of agape in the society at that time?
I think it was the biggest one up to that time. I think there were smaller things happening all during '66. In the Haight-Ashbury, there were these concerts and things in the park that were organized. But the thing about the be-in was that it increased the scale of that experience by a significant factor.
And did the be-in serve as a kind of ideal template for what the counterculture represented, and what might be possible on a broader scale in the distant future?
I think that was the hope. That was the aspiration. It was a moment in time, and then dealing with the reality of the day after, or the week, or the month after, was a different set of conversations. But I think the aspiration of that being, and then there were ones in New York and Los Angeles, and Easter Sunday, I think, and in between, I'm sure there were plenty in other parts of the country that I didn't show up in my research during the brief time I had to write the book. I think that was the idea, was that it could be kind of an example, or proving the concept, at least for an afternoon or something like that. That was so I think that was the that was kind of the idea of it.
Yeah. What you just said about the aftermath reminds me of what Joseph Campbell said. First he said, follow your bliss, which everybody remembers. But he also said, you have to follow your blisters.
I didn't remember that, and I am definitely going to use it going forward. That's a terrific a terrific modification.
Right, and I also picked up on that somewhere in your book. It was in the aftermath, possibly of the Be-In or one of the other early events. Allen Ginsberg came out on the stage and said something about we have to focus on our litter karma or something like that.
That was at the end of at the end of the Be-In. No, he told everyone clean up.
Yeah.
No, that was at the Be-In. He was to the extent that there was one person who was the closest thing to embodying, a lot of what I think was best of that inchoate culture. It was him. And the two heroes to me, the political hero was Dr. King, and the cultural hero was Allen Ginsberg. And they to me are they're human beings. They had imperfections, but they get the closest to being role models. That I would retrospectively want to still look up to.
I think it's fascinating that you said that. I noticed that in some of your other interviews, so I have some follow-up questions on that. But I think that's an amazing coupling to make, those two figures. So different in personal style, and yet their hearts were looking at the same thing.
Right. No, and as far as I know, they never met. And
they met twice, actually.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, I'm gonna bring that up a little later on.
Huh? Yeah,
I thought you might find that of interest because I wasn't sure if you knew about it, but I found.
No, I wish I'd known about it, but it's good to find out about it.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm also wondering if the broadening awareness that we have today regarding narcissism is connected to the intense blossoming of agape in the 60s, especially since love and empathy are the polar opposites, the antidotes to narcissism.
Well, I think that the 60s, kind of in broad strokes, the 60s, the way it's often used, the kind of shorthand for the different kind of cultural rebellion of that time, because obviously there were plenty of other things happening in the 60s too. But the 60s, to me, both helped be an antidote to narcissism in some instances and reinforced narcissism in others.
Absolutely.
I think that's the whole thing, even about a psychedelic experience. I think Ram Dass said, if you think everybody is God, you're a saint. If you think only you're God, they put you in a lunatic asylum. And the balance of there were people that became more narcissistic, and I think one would say sort of the cult leaders. The ultimate being, say, Charles Manson, but he was by no means the only person who developed kind of a cult of personality by wrapping themselves in the 60s and the psychedelic world. And then there were other people that really, I think, saw it as an antidote to, and it drew them closer to egalitarianism or agape. So I don't think the 60s only had a positive effect in the narcissism area. I think it was a mixed bag, and that's part of what we deal with today. It did not, in fact, fix everything. I think it's part of the long arc of history, more positive than negative. But it certainly didn't fix everything in our.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's just that as you point out in various points in your book, the media and the rewriting of history has so focused on the narcissistic aspect of the 60s. I think
yes.
The first part is largely forgotten. Why do we know so much? Why are we so much more aware of narcissism and sensitive to it today? I see a connection there. Positive connection. What was the relationship between agape? This is a big question. I know it's not easy to answer, but what was the relationship between agape and LSD, the LSD experience?
Well, for me, and I think for a lot of other people who took LSD, not everybody, but certainly my experience with it and that of a lot of the people like Ginsberg and Tim Leary and Richard Alpert and others, it was for that period of time of the trip, it triggered a consciousness of love, and it was people would look at a glass and say, "Oh my God, God is in the glass. The molecules are all the same energy," and kind of seeing this commonality. It's very similar to what Aldous Huxley wrote about in his mescaline experiences a decade earlier, and that it gave a temporary experience of universal love, and it was not permanent. And so how people reacted when they came down varied, and not everybody had that experience. You know, there are people that had bad experiences, but for a lot of us, and what made it so popular was that feeling of enormous love. That wasn't just transactional love or romantic love, but was just love of the universe, of whatever was in front of you. And that was definitely something that a lot of us experienced, and that was what we loved about it.
One of the really charming things about your book is the evocative title. What is the metaphoric significance of the Lost Chord, and what are the notes that it comprises?
Well, the metaphor is kind of alludes to what you said earlier, which was that there was this period that has largely been forgotten, which was before the cartoon version of the 60s became the established narrative of most of the media, and before the assassinations and some of the darkest aspects of it, there was this genuinely idealistic feeling. It was what I felt as a teenager. It's what inspired me as a teenager, and the reason I call it why it's lost is because I think the media and the cartoon version, the co-option of a lot of the external symbols, replaced that feeling with this sort of plastic version of the 60s. The why I call it chord is because it was the product of a lot of different things that together were if you were a teenager at that time you were experiencing, and it's the things that, I did it very much based on the things that I, as a kid, was influenced by. So there was a lot of other things going on that were equally important to other people, but I was, even though it's not a memoir, it's a history told through my eyes. It's a history of the things that I was inspired by. And those included the anti-war movement, it included the civil rights movement, it included the psychedelics, it included the music, it included this general curiosity about non-Western spiritual paths and an openness to it, and it was the particular, and it included an empowerment of young people that was also temporary, but which in the moment felt very exciting. That it did really feel like everything was changing for the better, and that one could be part of it even if you were 16, 17, or 18. And that combination of things didn't last. Even, I would argue, certainly by the end of '68, the balance of those notes was different. It was, again, we lost two of our great political leaders, and Robert Kennedy and Dr. King, and Nixon gets elected by the end, and in general, the drugs kind of got darker. There was just more speed and heroin, and drug dealers instead of psychedelic missionaries. And it didn't disappear, but it changed by then. So to me, I focused on a time period. It's arbitrary. It wasn't exactly the calendar dates, but the collection of things that happened in '67 to me were a really good stand-in for that collection of feelings that I remembered as creating a kind of hopefulness and optimism about the ability that the society might get better.
One of the wonderful things about your book is that when we open it, we think it's going to be about 1967, but really you take 1967 and hold it up as a sort of prism through which other points and events in the 60s are also seen through the magic, what Ed Sanders calls the magic year of 1967. It's one of the things I really liked about it. And I think writing a sort of subjective history of the 60s is in keeping with the spirit of the 60s in many ways.
Yeah, well, I think no two people had the same experience in the 60s, so it's by definition any history is subjective. I'm just being open about it. I mean, I think CNN's history of the 60s is also highly subjective, but different people, part of the thing was kind of this beginning of decentralization of people in small communities really thinking their opinions matter, their ideas about God and, sexuality and psychedelics and spirit, all of these different things mattered, as opposed to being just told kind of what to do by the authorities. The results weren't all good, but that was the nature of the time. Was this, people, everybody, when they said, I think I said this in the book, but when they said a gathering of the tribes, I mean, they initially just meant kind of the radicals and the hippies, but there were hundreds of tribes, because everybody in every living room was a tribe at that point. So I think it's all subjective, and when I did the publicity stuff for the book, people would come up to me and everybody would have their own kind of story, and they weren't all exactly the same stories. For some people it was seeing Jimi Hendrix, for some people it was sitting in a college president's office, for some people it was studying TM. Some people drugs were a big part of it, some people drugs were not a part of it at all, it was so it's inherently a subjective. It's just very hard but it's my version of it, and I think a lot of other people saw the same picture that I kind of saw.
Absolutely. I'm just a few years younger than you. I'm born in *56, end of '56, but your book brought back so many memories and of big and small things. I mean, you've got so many things that I forgot about from that period. Big and small things, but there were key things,
Yeah.
I mean, even talking about Carl Jung's introduction to the Willem Baines translation of the I Ching, very, as you say, that became a huge bestseller at the time.
Oh my God, the I Ching was such a big deal to me in high school, and
right. Me too.
Decades later, I would meet people who would say, "Oh my God, you turned me on to the I Ching," or I'd remember who turned me on to the I Ching, and it was a way of thinking about a cosmic issues in a different perspective without having to join a church or
really thinking out of
sign on to any set of behavioral agreements or anything. But it was a way of still honoring the idea that there's some other consciousness that's like smarter than the conversations we have in day-to-day life. And the fact that Jung wrote the intro was just such a big deal in retrospect, because he was validating it from from his perspective, and it's quite I reread it. It's just fantastic, his intro. He's I don't know as much about Jung as I'd like to, but what I know about him is so cool. Was such an interesting figure, and obviously that long predated the '60s. And as I have said, the ideas and the values of the '60s were not original to that time at all. They'd been around for centuries. What was unique was that they became part of the mass culture.
Absolutely. I mean, if you study, let's say, the history of literature, we talk about that in literature, that there is a perennial root to the romantic movement or romantic consciousness, which flowers now and then through time, through the millennia. In fact, Richard Wilhelm was a huge, the sinologist who translated the I Ching, was a huge influence on Jung. And what's also not widely known is that Jung would hire an astrologer on occasion to draw a horoscope on a patient he was having difficulty with. He didn't believe necessarily in the deterministic aspect of astrology, but he recognized the significance of it in terms of thinking out of the box. So the I Ching wasn't just incidental in his life.
Yeah.
Speaking of the I Ching, sometimes when things reach an extreme point, they can turn into their opposites, like the changing hexagram lines in the I Ching. How much of the '60s was due to a counterpoint reaction to the repressive atmosphere of the '50s, do you think?
Well, Tim Leary said, many times, I mean, he said it to me, but he said it to a lot of other people, you can't understand the '60s without understanding the '50s. So, I mean, certainly that was a guy that very much felt that it was connected, and obviously the Beats emerged in the '50s, and the Beats were an influence on a lot of '60s people. The Grateful Dead members bonded over their shared enthusiasm for Jack Kerouac, and Ken Kesey, obviously, who was an important '60s figure, was had Dean the real guy that was Dean Moriarty.
Neil Cassidy.
Neil Cassidy was, on the bus, and
right.
so the Dr. King, the civil rights movement really took a huge leap forward in the 50s with the Montgomery bus boycott. And the roots of the Vietnam War were in the 50s. The reaction to the Korean War and the Cold War and the first quote unquote advisors, in Vietnam, and the general mass culture, which was to a lot of people pretty shallow. There were only 3 channels, and there was the kind of fake plastic notion of what families were like that became the it seemed like one day that was reality and the next day it was a joke, and somewhere in between was Mad Magazine making fun of it enough to set the stage for the joke side, so this is a continuum, and there's nothing in the 60s that you can't connect to something in the 50s, and I tried to at least give some context to that in that one chapter, so it wasn't coming out of nowhere. I couldn't go back through the whole world history, what led up to it, but it's crazy, even though I'm focusing on 1 year, not to at least give context to what was leading up to it.
After Martin Luther King, in my opinion, probably nobody did more to advance civil rights in the 60s than Robert Kennedy, although that's another history that's been very suppressed by the mass media. But what isn't widely known is, and I was wondering if you knew about this, is that RFK was not opposed to the intelligent use of LSD. And this is a quote from the book Acid Dreams. Quote, in 1965, Congress passed the Drug Abuse Control Amendments, which resulted in even tighter restrictions on psychedelic research. The decision to curtail LSD experimentation was the subject of a congressional probe, which was led by Senator Robert Kennedy, whose wife Ethel reportedly underwent LSD therapy at Hollywood Hospital at Vancouver. And they quote Kennedy as saying, I think we have given too much emphasis and so much attention to the fact that LSD can be dangerous and that it can hurt an individual who uses it, that perhaps to some extent we have lost sight of the fact that it can be very, very helpful in our society if used properly. Were you aware of that, and what's your reaction?
No, I wish I
Isn't that fascinating?
had been thorough enough in my research to come up with that. I certainly would have included that in the book. I was not aware of it. I'm not completely surprised by it. I mean, there are a lot of rumors that John Kennedy took LSD.
Those are false, I have to tell you. Those are false, and I could be happy to pass along some information to you about the source of those. That was part of the what's called the silver bullet assassination of character on Kennedy after he died. But this actually, is in the congressional record.
No, and there's footage. Look, Tim Leary testified before another Senate committee that Ted Kennedy was on the panel of. There's footage of him talking about it. I think a year later or something, 66 or something. I mean, I'm not surprised by it. I wish I'd known it because it would have been a cool thing to add to the book. It's consistent with I very much view Robert Kennedy as a 60s character, in the Jefferson Airplane, like who never supported any other candidate that I know of, publicly supported him, and he met them and had them to Hickory Hill and all this sort of thing. I'm not surprised, but I wish I'd known it. That's the problem. I wrote the book very quickly. I wrote the book very, very quickly. I thought of it, and then I had a deadline because my publisher required that it be coming out in time for the 50th anniversary of The Summer of Love, which it was good that I had the deadline. But if I'd had another year, I'm sure I would have written a better book. But
it's endless, the information. There's so much happened in such a short period of time. But this popped into my mind, and I thought I would throw it out at you because this popped into my mind when I was rereading your book, and I saw that in the jukebox at Hickory Hill, the Kennedys
had White Rabbit,
had White Rabbit. So I thought, that's a very interesting connection.
I mean, I talked to Grace. Like, I didn't do that many interviews for the book, again, because of time constraints. But I did get to talk to her. Well, I had not met her before, but she was nice. I talked to her on the phone. She's very, very accessible and happy to talk about it. And, her take on it was, look, we didn't really know if they ever listened to White Rabbit. It was very good chance it was just done because they knew we were coming over, and,
Sure.
and they were using us because they saw us a way to get to the youth vote. But she said, but we were happy to be used by Robert Kennedy. Like, who better? You know? So, you know, it wasn't like
you can't
necessarily,
imagine
he wasn't quoting the lyrics, you know?
Right.
But it's nonetheless, it's true, and they were there, and that showed a certain level of awareness of other parts of the culture that most senators didn't have.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something you would have seen in the jukebox of the Reagan's house, you know.
Or
sure.
Hubert Humphrey.
Or Hubert Humphrey, right, good
you
point.
know, or Eugene McCarthy's,
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, and you know, as I said before, there are so many, besides the big things, there are so many little details in your book that I wasn't aware of that are just wonderful details. For example, that John F. Kennedy crossed the picket lines to see the film Spartacus, written by the blacklisted author whose name is slipping my mind right now.
Jordan Trumbo, yeah.
Trumbo, right, who wrote Johnny Got His Gun, right? So the Kennedys really were, in many ways, well ahead of their time, I think.
Yeah. No, I'm a fan of John Kennedy. I feel he's been underrated by history. I think in general, you know, that look, Chappaquiddick was a bad thing. I'm sure his behavior with women would,
I'm sorry, Danny, I didn't catch the first thing you said. Something was a bad thing, did you say?
No, Chappaquiddick.
Oh, Chappaquiddick.
You know, John Kennedy, I'm sure the stories about women are to some extent true, you know, and, but I think that as a political leader, he's really underrated when they do these ratings of the presidents. I mean, he was only in office 3 years, but to me, the fact that there was not a war over the Cuban Missile Crisis is like such a monumental achievement, given that, from what I've read, the entire military wanted him to attack, you know.
The entire Joint Chiefs of Staff was encouraging him to launch a nuclear first strike, and what they did not realize that there were, at the time,
that there were nukes in Cuba.
There were over 160 ready-to-go nuclear warheads aimed at the United States from Cuba. You know, what's also not widely known is that Kennedy and Khrushchev were conducting a secret correspondence that began well before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's probably only because of that they had enough trust in each other to each go around the war hawks in their respective administrations.
Yeah, and I think on civil rights he took steps in terms of moral leadership that Eisenhower never was willing to take.
Correct.
And, you know, the test ban treaty was a big deal, you know, and I am not, no one knows what he would have done in Vietnam, but I believe he would not have done what Johnson did. There's like, his brothers were against the war after he died. He had been to Vietnam as a young man. He knew that it was bullshit, and he had already confronted the military. You know, he wasn't going to be pushed around by them. I think that that's what I choose to believe, but no one can prove it.
The evidence certainly leans in favor of what you're saying, because there was a major conference in Honolulu shortly before he was killed, and it was laid down on paper that he was pulling out. You know, but that's again been very suppressed by the media.
Well, you know, there's this whole revisionism of how great LBJ was. Look, he did some terrific things, largely because he had the legacy of the love for Kennedy and this incredibly wide margins of Democrats in both houses of Congress. But I think he was a New Deal guy, and I think he wanted to do the right thing on those issues. But without John Kennedy, there's no fucking great society. You know,
absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely.
You know, but it's just one of those things, the way history is, you know. And the Republicans and the right wing, I think you're right, put a lot of energy into trying to tarnish Kennedy's legacy, and they succeeded.
What's also not widely known, but is on audio tapes, because the Kennedy White House did record their meetings, is that Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, and the Joint Chiefs in the early 60s, well before the Cuban Missile Crisis, had a meeting with Kennedy urging him to make a first strike against Russia because we still had a nuclear edge over them. And Kennedy stood up and walked out and turned to one of his aides and said, "And we call ourselves human beings."
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
Right. I mean, these are histories that are suppressed or forgotten.
Yeah.
And you can't imagine that kind of response if Nixon had been elected president.
Right.
God only knows what would have happened if Nixon was president during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One last LSD question for you. Because it is a big theme in your book and in the 60s, taking LSD is one thing, but psychically integrating the experience afterward is another. What insights did you gain from dropping acid, and how were you able to integrate them into your life? I noticed in the book you mentioned various times when you take acid, but you don't really go too much into your own personal experience.
Yeah.
Which I understand. It's the
No, I didn't feel that was
right.
what that book was going to be, and I didn't want to irritate people by being in it too much. I don't know. That's just how I decided to do it. Well, I think the biggest thing for me personally was it imbued me with a kind of optimism that I didn't have before. That I refer to it obliquely in the thing. It was like giving permission. It's okay to be happy. It doesn't mean you're intellectually unserious to have joy and happiness. Because I had my notion of what it was to be a smart person, based on whatever the intellectual influences were that I grew up around, which was kind of liberal, whatever all the stuff. The canon in my home was T.S. Eliot and Eugene O'Neill and whatever, and then there's J.D. Salinger, and there's whatever it is, Bernard Malamud and Philip. And it was all like, to be smart you had to be depressed and cynical,
right.
and people that were too happy must be stupid or not have depth.
Right.
It's like Woody Allen to me, who I doubt ever took LSD, kind of, but it's like that scene, in Annie Hall where these people are happy, and he says, well, people that are happy obviously just stupid, they don't get reality.
Right.
That was kind of the, that current of modernism, and it really allowed me to just enjoy and looking at a strawberry, or just to feel the moment. That was a big deal to me, because it was the closest thing to a spiritual experience that I had, that I could remember, at that point. And it opened the door to the idea that even if I wasn't attracted to the limited religious options that had been presented to me when I was growing up, that there was some bigger thing other than just sort of the external, what your grades were and how much money you made and what your resume said and all that sort of a thing. And that paradigm shift was greatly liberating to me and allowed me, I think, to have a little more confidence for sort of the rest of my life. For me, it was particularly helpful because I was not a good student. I had a so-called high IQ, according to the people who. So my parents told me, and whatever, and I did well in the SATs, but I was what today would be called ADD. I had a hard time with homework. I had this sort of I never found teachers that sort of got me, and I was just this huge failure in my own mind at 14 or 15 because I wasn't getting good grades, and my parents, who thought they had this smart kid, were but they're very lovely people. I miss my parents, and if there is reincarnation and you pick your parents, I'm fine if they're my parents next time too. But I was pretty unhappy with their disappointment in me at that time, particularly my mother's. And the psychedelic experience gave me this other way of defining myself. And then it turned out that there were all these other people that were going through the same thing, and so it was like overnight I'm part of a community. I'd never been part of a community. I'd been a loner because I couldn't find. Maybe I'd have one friend every year or two at the most, and we didn't even like each other that much, but we're all we had.
Right.
And then suddenly I was really part of this community where you just look down the street and feel connected with somebody. And psychedelics was part of that. It wasn't only the politics or the other things. So I'm very grateful for that. I felt ultimately that it wasn't used. I went completely anti-drug personally after I got arrested before my 18th birthday, and I was so freaked out that I put myself in that position. I just kind of stopped. And I'm not saying I never did drugs again, but I didn't do it for a long, long time. And in terms of psychedelics, I haven't felt the calling to revisit it since my early 20s. But I am very grateful for the role it played, and it gave me a sense of optimism and opened me up to the idea of spirituality in a way that nothing else in my life up to that point had done.
Oh, it's a great answer. Thank you for sharing that, Danny, because it's a very personal thing. I almost felt it was blasphemous to ask you that question. But,
no, I don't mind. I mean, if I was uncomfortable, I would have told you, but as it turned out, I was cool with it. Yeah.
Well, as we spoke about before, two 60s figures that you write of with great passion are Allen Ginsberg and Martin Luther King. What do they represent for you, and how would you estimate their importance?
Well, I mean, King to me is I never met Dr. King. I did meet Allen Ginsberg and had the privilege of getting to know him reasonably well the last few years of his life. I never met Dr. King, and King to me is sort of on a pedestal all of his own as kind of an American saint. I often go and listen to his speeches or sermons. A lot of it is out there, and he just was. The more time goes by, the more I'm impressed with how extraordinary he was as a being, not just his political effects, which were significant, obviously, and that's why there's a holiday named after him, but also just sort of as a spiritual prophet, and he talked so much about the soul and about the inner world, and made it come alive in a way that just didn't seem, So it's so. So to me, he's one of the great figures in American history or Western history, and he happened to live at that time, and he was part of the mix. And everybody who's read his life, I'm a big fan of the Taylor Branch trilogy. I mean, those are, as far as I know, the best books about his life, but I've read a lot of others. And he, in addition to how extraordinarily brilliant and morally grounded he was, and effective and tactically, brilliant, he had such a difficult time with the people around him. I mean, it was not like he got a lot of support. I mean, and to go back and realize how many opponents he had in the black and the white community, it makes his steadfastness even more remarkable. And it's like I said in the book, as far as we know, he never took psychedelics, but he didn't have to. He already was there. He talked about agape all the time. I mean, he had these sermons where he would say, the Greeks talked about 3 different kinds of love, and I mean that was a part of his regular language, So he's it's just incredible that he lived, and I think he's one of the greatest Americans, right? In the top 5 all-time Americans, and he was part of that period. But within the context of that period, he was not a lot of people, both that I admire, the Black Power movement and the hippie. He was not. People didn't realize he was necessarily, and I myself as a kid didn't really appreciate him as much as I do now. In terms of Allen, and I feel I'm allowed to call him that because I knew him, and I look right now at a picture of me and him as I'm sitting in my office here with you, and just an unbelievable life. I mean, he was certainly, along with On the Road, Howl is one of the 2 most important works of the beatnik culture. And then, unlike Kerouac, he continued to be relevant in every subsequent decade of his life. He was particularly powerful culturally in the period of time I write about, because as far as I can tell, he was almost unique in his ability to be accepted and respected in all of these different subcultures who otherwise detested each other. You know, the fact that everyone from Emmett Grogan to William F. Buckley, accepted Allen Ginsberg,
It's incredible.
is mind blowing. And he just had a wide enough. I forget which poet he admired. I contain multitudes. Is that Whitman or Blake? I forget which one it is, but he contained fucking multitudes, And
Whitman,
I think, yeah, Whitman, And Whitman, I did again over Allen's bed in the last place he had. There was probably in all subsequent ones, but the only one I visited was a picture of Whitman. And it was like the only picture over his bed. It wasn't like he had a zillion pictures, So he that was certainly his his North Star.
Yeah, he personally identified greatly with Whitman, also because they both had that connection of being gay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you familiar, by the way, with his poem "A Supermarket in California," in which Whitman appears?
I am, I'm not. Look, I don't know all of his poetry.
You don't have to know it. It's okay.
I'm familiar with it, and I go back. I just recently was looking through some of his collected works for another reason, because I'm familiar with it. I mean, the one
it's
that
such a funny poem because he sees Whitman lecherously squeezing the fruits and eyeing the grocery store boy. It's such a funny, wonderful, well-crafted poem.
Yeah, no, he's quite the guy. I mean, my favorite of his poems is Wichita Vortex Sutra. That to me is sort of the quintessential '60s poem of his.
Talk about that. Why do you like that? What do you see in that?
To me, it was a fully mature commentary on what was happening in America at that time in a way that. I think I wrote a piece for there's a lefty website called Truth Dig.
Yeah, I know.
And I wrote kind of my review of the Ken Burns
Robert Shear's website.
Rob Shear's website. So I wrote a review of the Ken Burns multi-part thing on the Vietnam War, and I said, look, if you actually want to know what was happening, you're better off reading Wichita Vortex Sutra.
Yes.
But in terms of the official history and what we get, from things that are funded by big corporations and broadcast on PBS, this is pretty good, I mean, then I had some criticisms of it. I mean, most of my friends thought I was too critical of it, and then some of my friends thought I wasn't critical enough of it. But
are you familiar with James D. Eugenio's long essay on all the problems with that piece? Not your piece, but with the film.
I don't know. I read, when I was doing my piece, I read whatever was on the web at the time.
I would love to
try to take it into account, and I'll be happy. Pass it on, and then I'll send you what I wrote. What happens with me is, I get immersed in these things, and then I'm on to the next.
Sure,
And like now I'm writing, my next book is about Kurt Cobain, so I'm like living in the 90s right now.
Right.
And, this is like, I mean, I'm so grateful to talk to you about the 67 book, and every once in a while I still get to talk about it, and for the rest of my life I'll be proud of it, but my concentration is fragmented right now by the other thing I'm working on, which is a different, and that's a more personal book, because I work with Kurt, and it's also more painful, but it's also more commercial.
Oh, well, do put me on your advanced copy reviewer list. I'd be glad to help you get some attention on that book.
Thank you. It's next spring. It's a year away from coming.
Good.
14 months away. Yeah.
Well, this is what Allen Ginsberg said about his two encounters with King. During the first, his partner Peter Orlovsky asked King, quote, if he had any dreams. He said, yeah, I had a dream that I was dead, and that my enemies hid my funeral so that my friends would not know where the funeral would be. And I saw him again in '67 at Duke University. I asked King whether he knew anything about marijuana, psychedelics, LSD. He didn't, but he was tolerant. He just said, I don't know. I'd have to ask my friends. Kind of a curious quote, huh?
Well, it's It's what he said, you know. I'm sure he didn't know. I mean, again, you think of what King is going through at that time. You know, he didn't have what we would call today the bandwidth to take on a new subject matter. But
well, I meant more about.
But
the
I like that he was open to it, because a lot of people from the political world, especially on the left, you know, were very judgmental and saying this is a distraction from serious activity. You know, that's what Tom Hayden believed till his dying day, and I loved Tom Hayden and considered him a pretty good friend. And I talked to him on a regular basis till, you know, a few months before he died. And I talked to him once just about the '60s. For a while, I had this podcast that I've kind of stopped doing, and I just wanted to talk to him about that. And he was like still felt it had all been negative, you know, and a lot of people on the left felt that, and it just showed. But that's, you know, King was not that guy. King was, you know, had an open mind and an open heart, you know, and he was a mystic. I'm sure that in another, if you could create a conversation between Aldous Huxley and Martin Luther King, I'm sure they'd have a lot to say to each other.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the quote really shows his tolerance, and then also his open-mindedness, and also the dream is just, you know, what can you say about that dream that he knew
who his enemies were. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, it's like fucking, you know, Jake or Hoover, you know? Are you kidding me?
And you know the part where he says my enemies,
and all the mainstream civil rights groups, and you know,
right.
and the young radicals, you know. I mean, it's unbelievable how, and then apparently within the SCLC was complete infighting and chaos all the time. They, you know, it's unbelievable that he stayed centered through all that. I just, it's saintly. There is no other word for it.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good word for it. And not to mention J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO operation, which probably infiltrated his organization.
Oh, there's no question about that.
And you know, when I saw that quote, my enemies hid my funeral so that my friends would not know where my funeral would be, you could just see J. Edgar Hoover wanting to do something like that. I mean, it's that bizarre, you know. Emmett Grogan and Peter Coyote, both members of the San Francisco Diggers, took a malign view of the media's effect on the counterculture, while Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin regarded mass media as a powerful tool to be exploited for their own ends. Maybe you could talk a little about the differences between the Diggers on the West Coast and the Yippies on the East Coast.
Sure. The Yippies were definitely influenced by the Diggers. There's no question about that. And Abbie Hoffman in particular spent time with Emmett Grogan and Peter Coyote, and you know, I think there was a brief period when he called himself Abbie Digger. I'm not sure of that, but I know Jim Farad, who was one of the founders of the Yippies, absolutely called himself Jim Digger for a while, and a lot of the sense of theater, something like the throwing the money onto the stock exchange, you know, was very much out of the Digger playbook of of trying to create a theatrical event in public that would illustrate a larger point, and a lot of the language and so on. But you know, they were, and Coyote, when I interviewed him for the book, was still kind of complaining about it, even though he softened to the point of saying he did believe that Abbie was a good person who was compassionate and trying to do the right thing, but that he felt very much, betrayed by the self-aggrandizement and the publicity seeking ways of Abbie. And, the Diggers had kind of this very austere, purist notion of what was righteous, and, they were obsessed with anonymity, and they were obsessed with everything should be free, and they were basically criticized almost everybody else who wasn't a Digger. It's hard to find anybody that was active in the counterculture that they had good things to say about. although I do think they got along with the Black Panthers initially, and definitely it was their mimeograph machine that the Panthers used for the first issues of their newsletter. So Abby definitely kind of hung out with them, and then left them, when they felt when he did steal this book, that it was a lot of their ideas, and that he put his name and face on it, and that was and Grogan and Abby personally hated each other by all accounts, as I put in the book, Paul Krasner, who's one of the people I dedicated the book to, told me that Anita Hoffman had told him that Grogan had actually raped her as part of just kind of his expressing his hostility to Abby Hoffman. So and there are people to this day who I spoke to who were very much, the Diggers were the real thing and the Yippies were posers, and then I don't agree with that. I respect the Diggers. I respect their intellectual originality and their courage and their commitments, and they definitely were on the cutting edge, particularly in the formation of the Haight-Ashbury community, but I think they also became bullies and were not open-minded about other people trying to do the work in different ways at the time, and I think Abby Hoffman was an egotist and did like attention, but he also had his sense of theatricality and understanding of the media allowed me as a teenager to hear these ideas. Otherwise, his interest in the media and him and Jerry Rubin's, interest in McLuhan and, all that sort of thing, and Krasner's, publication of The Realist and their commitment to, communicating to the masses, reach people that the Diggers would never have reached, and I think that there was also so I think they both played their role. Neither of them were perfect. I'm not a big fan of, in retrospect, of the protests outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago in '68, and I didn't go. I remember people were giving out leaflets, and I thought, why the fuck would I want to do that? I was 18. I definitely was at an age. I had my own apartment. I could have gone, and I definitely didn't want to go. Ginsberg was against it for reasons he's discussed, and Peter Coyote says that he also cautioned against it. For reasons which are now clear, but I do think they meant well. I think they just got, they got too intoxicated with their own drama to see how rapidly things were changing and what the playing field was and all that. But I don't think the Yippies are. I didn't write a book about the Yippies. I respect the Yippies, but I was always put off by the amount of anger that was in what the Yippies conveyed. Again, I was more of a hippie, not a Yippie. But I respect them, and I particularly respect Paul, who is just one of my favorite people I ever met, and I guess to me had an exemplary life. And Hoffman to me, died tragically and had his issues, but I really think he was extremely positive force in his day. Rubin, a little more of an annoying figure, although I did meet him personally several times before he died, and he was very nice. I think, and I think that I think he was kind of the most narcissistic of all of them. But I think they were on the right side of things, and didn't have any kind of a long-term vision, and made some mistakes. But listen, Hayden, coming from the non-psychedelic, non-Digger influenced left, was also there in Chicago with them. The Chicago 7 included, Tom Hayden and other SDS people. So it's not like the political radicals have more to be proud of.
Absolutely. There was an awful lot of black and white type of thinking going on back then, which is easy to see now in retrospect.
Yeah.
When I was reading your book, I thought how ironic it was that Emmett Grogan always spoke against the cult of the ego, and yet he was clearly an egomaniac. While Hoffman loved the spotlight, he never hesitated to sacrifice his personal comfort and safety for the cause, and was often violently attacked by the police. So it's very much a mixed bag. Have you read Grogan's book, Ring Alivio?
Yes.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I thought it was really good. I think it's a really good book. I'm not a great lover of, as I learn more about Grogan, and like Coyote told me in one of the interviews I did for the book, one of my scoops, which only people obsessed with the 60s would notice, but, is he said that as he's gotten older, he says, I see those grainy videos of Emmett, he says, and I'm kind of embarrassed by how influenced I was by him, and I really see, his limitations. He says, he's always my brother, and I always think of him every year on his death. He does some Buddhist ceremony, and he says, but I don't stand by everything it was really interesting, Coyote is just a big soul, I mean, one of the great, in terms of the experience of writing the book, talking to him was one of the high points. I was just on the phone, but I was like really vibrating afterwards, and, I don't agree with every single thing he says, but 95%.
Right.
And I think what an interesting life he's had. He's one of the fucking narrators on the Ken Burns series.
Right.
What an arc.
Yeah, he's had an extraordinary life, absolutely. Seems like a very nice guy. I see that you recorded Allen Ginsberg doing his last readings before he died. Any interesting anecdotes that you could share about that?
I got to meet him kind of first in the when I was living in LA in the late 80s. We had a mutual friend, and I was the chairman of the Southern California ACLU Foundation, and Alan had a lifelong love for the ACLU because, of course, they had defended City Lights Press when Howell was indicted for obscenity and won that case. And so he was interested in me, and I was just like totally in awe of him, but he was so nice. And he introduced me, I couldn't work this into the book, but he introduced me to Oscar Janiger, who was his cousin and living in LA. He said, come on, let's go visit my cousin Oscar. Do you know about him? And I got to meet Oscar Janiger with it, and then I lost touch with him, and then I saw him play this song, Ballad of the Skeletons, at a benefit for Tibet House. And one of the musicians on stage was Lenny Kaye, who I knew. And I said, and at that time, by this time, I'm president of Mercury Records, and it's kind of the peak of my career as a record executive, where I had money that I could just spend as long as we had enough hits. It was the boom years of the record business, and we had a couple of very good years. So I could do pretty much what I wanted within certain financial limitations, and it was not very expensive to record that song. So Alan called me like right away, and then he was very happy about the idea of putting out a record of this, and we ended up having a guy named Hal Wilner came in and really helped with the production. Lenny was the official producer, but Hal was definitely involved and put it out as a single, and then he called me and he said, look, there's an exhibit of, and then from then on, I mean, about 3 or 4 times a year, I'd have these dinners at my house, and Alan would come, and there was always a lot of people that wanted to meet him, but we keep it small, and introduce him to different people, and he was just like, every minute I was with him, I couldn't believe that I got to spend time with him. And my biggest regret, thinking back on it, because I was so busy then, that was the peak of my workaholic record executive time in my life, is that I didn't spend more time with him. When he was teaching this class on Blake at Brooklyn College, and I could have just audited it, and I should have what was it? But I had a job. I was running a company.
Sure.
So he was just incredible, and he'd bring a blues record over to the house. But on Ballad of the Skeletons, he calls me and he says, look, there's a exhibit of my photos in L.A. or somewhere in California, and somebody from MTV bought one of them. Is this somebody important? I said, who is it? He said, Tom Freston. I said, yeah, he's the CEO of MTV. That's somebody's pretty fucking important. He says, maybe we could use this, So I called Tom, and he couldn't believe that he could meet Allen Ginsberg. I mean, he was a huge fan of the thing. So we had this dinner, and then Tom said, look, give me anything, and I'll promise I'll play the video all the time. So Gus Van Sant, who loved the beatnik culture and had done stuff with Burroughs, did a video, which you can see on YouTube. I think it cost $10,000 or something, and it was on, the highest thing you could get on MTV, the most rotations. It was called Buzzbin, there was like light, medium, heavy, and then buzzbin was like the thing that they play like 6 or 8 times a day. So for 4 weeks we had Allen Ginsberg in buzzbin on MTV, and Allen told me he got laid more than once being able to show young guys, say, hey, want to see my video? And it made me so happy I could give him a moment of happiness because he gave so much. He was just the greatest guy. I mean, just generous, thoughtful. I don't know what he was like when he was younger. By the time I met him, I mean, he was just, again, saintly. And, I remember my daughter, Katie, was about 5 or 6 years old. One time he was over at the house. And so she came over to me to show me a drawing of a cat, and she showed it to Alan, too. She's an extrovert. And he looked at it and he says, needs whiskers. So she came back and did whiskers. He was like, he was extremely intelligent human being. So it was an honor to do it, and I got to do it. That's all. I went to the photo I have with him is from the studio when he did the record. But I was an executive. I was just pushed a button that made it happen. I wasn't like there for hours while he was doing it or anything like that.
I think he was as great a poet as he was a positive social force.
No, I think he's one of the great poets of his generation. He was one of the great social. He was multiple great. He was great in multiple categories. I think arguably a spiritual teacher of a significant amount. And studied with a lot of people and passed that along in his own way. Political force when it need be. But no, his greatest. The first word is poet. Yeah.
Danny, one last question. Do you think it was a mistake back then to create this language of an us versus them, of straights versus squares? And what's the lesson to be learned from that today? I'm thinking about the politically correct jargon.
Yeah. No, I definitely think it was a mistake. I think that was one of the big mistakes. I certainly thought that way. I definitely wanted to know who was ahead and who wasn't ahead.
Right.
And in those days, straight meant not taking drugs. It didn't have a sexual connotation to it, and that there was us and them, and that they were shallow and didn't, and that created a resentment, of a lot of people who felt left out of the party, and I think that helped fuel the divisions that we live with today in this society. It was, and I think the language of a lot of the people I admired then, reinforced this idea of kind of dehumanizing what we called, the establishment. I was talking to one of the few. I tried, like I said, not to put myself too much into the book because I was 17, 16, 17 years old, not that interesting a person. But to give it some life, I told some stories. And I told my best friend in high school was named Joel Goodman. He's Paul Goodman's nephew, and we were talking about it for the book, about the feeling. And, he said, I would just think we were so like the establishment sucks, and the machine is so wrong. He says, but then I'd be on the subway, and I would think, well, somebody had to make this. A lot of, it was quite a lot of effort went into digging the tunnels and creating the machinery and maintaining it, and and it's quite a good thing to be able to get on the subway in New York if you want to get from one place to another. So even though undoubtedly there was corruption and probably some of the people there, might have been racists or misogynists. They might have been pro-war or, who knows? But I'll tell you one thing: they did create a fucking subway system, and we were laughing about this, and there wasn't quite enough appreciation enough of what it went. To criticize civilization was morally correct, given the racism and the materialism and the militarism, but to not recognize the good things about civilization was ridiculous, and that not everybody. So yeah, the us and them thing, the polarization, we contributed to it. Those of us in the counterculture, the whole word counterculture says that,
right?
And it doesn't. It didn't. I think it contributed to some of the polarization that gives us the resentment of some of the people that support Trump. I think that when I tried to, I did this sort of email correspondence with Ram Dass about this. He lives in Hawaii now and is confined to a wheelchair since his stroke. But the answers he gave me, he was clearly thinking that he's quite proud of. Again, he's never shied away from thinking that LSD was a good thing, and he's not. But the polarization, was counterproductive, and that's something we have to try to heal the damage that was caused by that.
Good answer. Well, thank you so much for your time, Danny. I really enjoyed talking to you today. That was wonderful.
Very nice of you to have this interest, and I thank you.